This lecture coincides with Chapter 12 of Diana Kendall's Social Problems in a Diverse Society, which focuses on problems in the educational system in the U.S. Now, there are lots of ways to receive an education or become educated in the United States. In this chapter, we're primarily referring to formal education, so education that's performed or provided by schools. And when we talk about education, we think of it as a social institution. And it's a social institution because it's responsible for transmitting knowledge, skills, and cultural values in a formally organized structure. And the functionalist perspective holds that education is extremely important to the smooth functioning of society. Now, the functionalist perspective also focuses on education as a means to personal fulfillment and a route toward upward mobility. So we know, for example, that on average, as one's education level increases, so does their income. And increased income is an example of upward mobility in the class hierarchy. So upward mobility and formal education are very tightly linked. Now, when problems within education systems occur, they can usually be traced to educational institutions, so schools, colleges, universities, not fulfilling one of their manifest functions. And remember, we talked about this in the first chapter. Manifest functions are the intended consequences or goals of an activity or social institution. Now, the first manifest function of education is socialization. So schools teach students the student role, how to be a student. They teach them specific academic subjects, and they teach them political socialization, how to be good Americans. Next, we have transmission of culture. So schools transmit cultural norms and values to each new generation, and this plays a major role in assimilation, the process whereby recent immigrants learn dominant cultural values, attitudes, and behaviors. The third type of manifest function is social control. So schools are responsible for teaching values such as discipline, respect, obedience, punctuality, and perseverance. Schools teach conformity by encouraging young people to be good students, to be conscientious future workers of America, etc. Now, the next manifest function of education is social placement. So schools are responsible for identifying the most qualified people to fill available positions in the workforce and society. And graduates receive the appropriate credentials for entering the paid labor force with formal education. And the last manifest function of education is change and innovation. So to meet the needs of student populations at particular times, new programs are created. College and university faculty are expected to conduct research and publish new knowledge for the overall society. Now, in contrast, latent functions are the unintended consequences of an activity or social process that are hidden and remain unacknowledged by participants. Now, education also fills a number of latent functions. First, compulsory school attendance keeps children and teenagers off of the streets and, by implication, out of trouble. Another latent function of education is by keeping kids and teens out of the full-time job market for a number of years. This sort of serves as a controlling flow of workers into the workforce. And then finally, by bringing people of similar ages, racial and ethnic groups, and social class backgrounds together, schools establish social networks. One of the latent effects of social networks is that schools serve as, believe it or not, a matchmaking purpose. So future workers are partnered together with potential investors, and also future romantic partners might meet in school. Interestingly, I recently read that Facebook analysis say that 28% of married couples attend the same college, and 15% of people who are on Facebook say that they went to high school with their spouse. So, as we can see, matchmaking is a latent function of education. Now, functionalists argue that dysfunction is extremely problematic to the functioning of society. So, are there dysfunctions within the educational system? And there definitely are. A major dysfunction in education is that our public schools are not adequately preparing students for jobs in the global world, for global competition. So, comparative rankings of students across countries on standardized reading, math, and science tests show that U.S. students are lagging behind compared to other similarly situated countries. And the current state of the economy plays part of the role in this problem. Now, in the past, to reform some of the problems with education, most of you have probably heard of No Child Left Behind. And this was the act that George W. Bush signed into law in 2001. This act is largely deemed a failure because it now focuses on teaching to the test. So, teaching students how to be able to answer these questions that are put forth on these standardized tests rather than actually learning to think critically. Now, other critics of No Child Left Behind argue that the program does not address the main problems with American public education, which is the lack of funding and incentives for teaching and learning. Now, more recently, in 2010, the Obama administration issued a new act called A Blueprint for Reform. And this introduces 4 major priorities: to improve teacher and principal effectiveness, to provide information to families and educators to help improve student learning, to implement new college and career-ready standards and development assessments, and to improve student learning by providing intensive support and intervention. Now, unfortunately, due to the poor state of the U.S. economy, the political climate hasn't yet been very supportive of increasing funding to education. And a lot of people think that this is a real problem in America, our lack of interest in funding education. So these are things that we really need to take into consideration when we think about policy and where our tax monies go. Now, another possible dysfunction is, and some of you may have heard of this term, brain drain. And the brain drain problem refers to the situation where a country loses its best workers. For example, skilled workers in developing countries, such as India or Pakistan, may be attracted by better rates of pay and better working conditions in wealthier countries. It also means that because in the U.S. we're not investing in our own brain science, we're no longer producing the best and the brightest minds at the rate that we once were. So many U.S. technology, medical, energy, and science companies are hiring foreign scientists rather than scientists that we're trying to cultivate here in the U.S. And there are a couple of consequences of this. Brain drain means that developing countries struggle to develop because their best schooled labor leaves the economy. So, for example, instead of going to medical school in New Delhi and returning to their home village or town to practice medicine and participate in the local economy, these people are being lured to the US and other wealthy countries for us to access their brain power very cheaply. Thus, it becomes pretty hard to break the cycle of losing the best workers. And as a result, the pressure to produce scholars and scientists within the US wanes, and so does funding. According to conflict perspectives, schools, which are supposed to actually reduce social inequality, actually perpetuate inequalities based on class, race, and gender. And according to Pierre Bourdieu, students from middle and upper income homes have considerable cultural capital because their parents have taught them about books, art, music, and other forms of culture. So think of cultural capital as the ideas and knowledge that people draw on as they participate in social life. And this can be everything from rules of etiquette to being able to speak and write effectively, even things like knowing how to fill out college applications and having parents who can help you with homework. All of these things can be considered cultural capital, so information that we take with us into our daily lives. But children from low income and poverty level families, however, have a hard time acquiring cultural capital. So they've not had the same opportunities. Social class directly affects the acquisition of cultural capital, as does parents' level of education. And even immigrant status and nationality can affect how much cultural capital one brings with them. Now, other conflict theorists suggest that elites actually manipulate the masses and maintain their power in society through what is called a hidden curriculum. And this hidden curriculum teaches students to be obedient and patriotic, values that uphold the status quo in society, and turn students into compliant workers and consumers. Now, although students from all social classes experience the hidden curriculum to some degree, working class and poverty level students are most adversely affected. The hidden curriculum makes working class and poverty level students aware that they will be expected to arrive at work on time, follow bureaucratic rules, take orders from others, and experience high levels of boredom without complaining. And functionalists would call these types of functions manifest or latent. What do you think these types of functions might be? Manifest or latent? Well, these would be manifest functions. And then furthermore, the limitations on what and how they're taught mean that many of these students do not get any access to higher education and never receive the credentialism that they need to enter high-paying professions. Symbolic interactionist perspectives have a little bit of a different focus. They believe that education is an integral part of the socialization process, which is true, though the formal structure of schools and interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers either help or inhibit students from developing a concept of self that lasts long beyond their years of schooling. So when students learn, develop, and function effectively, their experience in school is positive. But for many students, the school environment and peer group interactions leave them very discouraged and unhappy. When students who might do better with some assistance from teachers and peers are instead labeled as losers, they come to view themselves as losers as well, and this results in a self-fulfilling prophecy. We talked about this a little bit with labeling theories in the section on crime and criminology. Now also, when we think about standardized tests, these can also lead to labeling and self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, one of the specific problems in education is this concept of functional illiteracy. And today, 14% of U.S. adults, about 30 million people, are functionally illiterate. And illiteracy is much higher for minority group members than for U.S.-born whites. When functional literacy is measured, not just in terms of reading words from a page, but also in regard to practical matters, such as understanding a bus schedule or filling out a bank deposit slip, we find that many, many more Americans qualify as illiterate, and this is what we call functional illiteracy. So one study concluded that nearly half of the adult population in this country was functionally illiterate for some of these tasks. So this is not just a problem for immigrants, but also for native-born Americans. And some social analysts believe that illiteracy will not be as much of a problem in the future due to technology. But other sociologists come back and say, well, we still have problems in access to technology. Not everybody has the same training to be able to use technology. Not everybody has the same access to be able to afford to use the internet, etc. So they believe that this sort of illiteracy will never really be completely equal, that will never really be on an equal playing field unless everything is equal from the ground up. This slide focuses on a short article that I posted under the information for this week called Unequal Childhoods by Annette Lareau. And the study focuses on unequal access to parenting, education, all of these types of things. Please take a few minutes to read this article. You will see questions on this in the future. So let's talk about problems with education that specifically focus on race, but also class and gender. And we can't start talking about this without first thinking about the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which focused on desegregation and integration of schools. And this court ruling stated that separate but equal schools, so equal or schools that are primarily segregated by color, so primarily African American schools, primarily white schools, that these types of schools are unconstitutional because they're inherently unequal. Now, what we find, though, is that racial segregation still appears to be increasing in education rather than actually decreasing. How can that be? Well, efforts to bring about racial desegregation, so the abolition of legally sanctioned racially ethnic segregation, or integration, which is taking specific action to change the racial class or the composition of the student body, have been extremely slow because segregated schools mirror race and class-based residential segregation. So when neighborhoods are segregated by color or by class, it naturally follows that the schools themselves that are based on tax brackets from specific neighborhoods, that they will mimic the residential area. Now, racial segregation is also evident when practices such as tracking are used to assign students to courses and programs based on their test scores and prior grades. There's also a connection between the number and quality of faculty and dropout rates. Racially segregated schools typically have more students per teacher. They typically have inexperienced teachers who are sometimes less qualified, and they expect lower things of students. They have lower expectations of students, which results in higher dropout rates. We also find in the U.S. that there's a racial ethnic education gap. U.S. schools continue to be very segregated. In some states, more than half of all African American students attend predominantly black schools, with a fraction of the funding of white schools. So students of color make up more than half of public school students in many states because white, non-Hispanic students are enrolled in either charter schools, suburban school districts, or private schools, which are predominantly white. This is also problematic because the high percentage of Hispanic students who do not complete school as a result of this. Now, according to recent studies, these high dropout rates among Hispanic students were closely related to practices in school and attitudes within the community. Students from poor families are 3 to 4 times more likely to drop out of school to go to work to help support their families than affluent families. Let's talk about spending on education for a moment. If we invest more money in schools, will students' scores improve? Some of you probably did not read this excerpt in your text, so it's still pretty interesting. I'm taking this actually directly from the text. When political leaders and other policymakers debate problems in education, they often use statistics to back up their arguments, and statistics that show some problems. such as large class size or inadequate school facilities, find that it might be reduced if more money were spent on education. However, statistics also show that simply spending more money does not guarantee better outcomes for children's success. So this particular figure shows that although federal discretionary spending on education more than doubled between 1990 and 2009, this additional expenditure has not improved overall reading scores. Now, we also find that in subject areas other than reading, such as history, American students score very poorly. Only 20% of fourth graders, 70% of eighth graders, and 12% of 12th graders showed proficiency on recent history exams given by the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. And on a civics exam, less than half of all U.S. eighth graders knew the purpose of the Bill of Rights. And 75% of 12th graders could not name a power granted to Congress by the U.S. Constitution. In fact, elementary school children in most other high-income countries have better understandings of American politics and American history than do American students. So on the basis of these data, should we assume that less money should be spent on education? Well, definitely not. But the statistics do show that money alone isn't always the answer to pressing social problems in our nation. In the case of education, it's about how we spend our money and about what we focus on. Do we want to teach children to think for themselves and to think critically and to be able to process information? Or do we want them just to focus on rote memorization so they can have higher scores on tests? So now let's talk about one of the most significant problems with higher education. A lot of you are dealing with this right now. Loan rates are expected to continue to rise. And a report issued in mid-August by the Department of Education shows that 57% of students received some sort of federal aid, and 41% of all undergrads had taken out loans, up from 35% 4 years ago. This summer, Congress passed a law tying interest rates on loans to the market. So the law set rates for all the loans at different levels, but based them all on the 10-year U.S. Treasury rate and allowed rates to change each year. So what we find is that for Stafford loans, both the subsidized and unsubsidized, the interest rate is the Treasury rate plus 2.05%, with a cap of 8.25%. And 8.25% on student loans is extremely high. You can buy a car for 3%, and you can buy a house for 5.2%. Graduate student loan rates are the Treasury rate plus 3.6% with a cap of 9.5%. And parent loans are the Treasury rate plus 4.6% with a cap of 10.5% interest. So while this might offer immediate relief to students, those rates are expected to continue to rise in coming years and give the federal government $175 billion in profits from student loans over the next decade. So the question here is, instead of making a profit on student loans, why doesn't the government try to help out the millions of students who are struggling financially and, at the very least, lower interest rates on educational loans? Some sociologists say that they don't understand how the government expects this generation to support themselves after graduation, starting with a mound of debt in a lot of areas and no job possibilities. And a lot of you are really dealing with this struggle right now. Well, in addition, we find that it's even more dire for minority students and students from poor and working class backgrounds. They're hit the hardest. They're the least likely to get scholarships because of attending schools with little funding and having less cultural capital than middle and upper class students. Additionally, there are issues with even getting into some types of schools. Some schools have eliminated affirmative action for college enrollment, which effectively reduces minority enrollments in college. So now let's talk about some proposed solutions or ideas for solutions to problems with education. Functionalist or conservative solutions look at the following. Their approach to educational problems emphasizes the importance of ensuring that the manifest function of education is fulfilled. So students should be taught the basics so that they can become contributing members of the U.S. workforce. Education problems must be dealt with so that more students will graduate from high school and attend college. Functionalists typically solve educational problems through the creation of more stringent academic requirements. Teachers receive more rigorous training, and evaluation expectations for student performance are raised. So some conservative political leaders suggest that increased support for struggling students and underperforming schools might help. And this is kind of where the foundation of No Child Left Behind came from. They argue that for requiring schools to use federal funds for tutoring and school choice, that they have to have higher test scores. So many functionalists want to reward the best teachers with financial incentives to move them to underperforming schools. Functionalists also want to make American schools more competitive so that more students will graduate from school ready to take jobs in the advanced global marketplace. Conflict theorists desire major restructuring in public education because they believe the problem with education is based in the divide between the rich and the poor. Exclusive private schools prepare upper-class children for future leadership positions, while working-class and poor children attend overcrowded, underfunded public schools. And disparities in school funding have to be done away with so that all children have truly equal educational opportunities. Liberal political leaders argue for consistently updated legislation that fights discrimination and gender and sexual inequality in schools. Conflict theorists also argue that funding has to be a priority, that the entire nation will decline unless we begin to invest in better educating our populace across the board. And then finally, if we look at the symbolic interactionist approach, this focuses on individuals and small groups in the educational setting. They perceive the problem as occurring when we label students as low achievers based on standardized test scores. Students may come to believe that they are incapable of achieving at the same level as their peers. So, for example, girls lacking self-confidence to excel in math and engineering. Symbolic interactionists believe that teachers should be trained about the importance of expectations to student achievement. Students who expect more of themselves often live up to those expectations.